Let me welcome you all. It's a massive intellectual relief to read a book about India and Pakistan, which is not about conflict primarily, and which is about how, at least in the early years, the two newly constituted states dealt with their citizens and those, or their future citizens, that would be a better term, as human beings. A book on that period which does not concentrate on armies fighting in Kashmir, but deals with how people got married and what happened to properties, how you acquired properties, how you lost properties and resettled. It's though the story is painful, but an attempt to engage with the quotidian lives of people. Basira has done it, so it's wonderful to read this. You call it an alternative history of India-Pakistan relationship. I could call it a quotidian history, everyday history of the India-Pakistan relationship in 47 to 52. Pallavi Raghavan is an assistant professor of international relations, history and international relations at Ashoka University just outside Delhi. This book, which she's going to cover in her talk here, Animosity at Bay, or an alternative history of the India-Pakistan relationship 1947-52, is published by Oxford and Hurst in 2020. 2 years ago, maybe less than 2 years ago. When I first met her in Delhi, she had finished at Cambridge, but the book was being written, or the dissertation was being transformed into a book. She taught previously at OP Jindal Global University. Actually, that's where she was teaching when I first met her. I have also been a fellow at the Center for Policy Research, CPR, in New Delhi. The book is based on her doctoral dissertation in modern South Asian history at the University of Cambridge. Welcome, Pallavi. Look forward to your presentation on this very important book.
Thank you so much, Professor Varshni, for having me and for your generous introduction. And thank you so much, Professor Zamindar, for having me. I mean, I just wanted to say how pleased and excited I was to receive this invitation, and I'm really looking forward to your, questions and comments about this book. It's a real honor for me to be here, and thank you very much for kind of giving up what does, just looking outside, what does look like a really, good, happy hour kind of slot, and sort of listening to. Accounts of state formation in the 1950s instead. And now that you're here, you have no choice but to be subjected to my book, and I'm going to take you through the main arguments that it makes. I also wanted to say thank you to Stephanie, who was like a real pleasure to interact with on email. I thought, I just wanted to kind of take a little bit of time and kind of talk you through the main arguments that the book makes, and and then leave it there, and I'm happy to answer your questions after that. And the book itself is based on my PhD thesis, which I wrote at the University of Cambridge. I was working with Joya Chatterjee, and it was actually being written at a time when there was, the beginnings of what is now in full flow, a really decisive turn towards historical international relations, and that set of literature of South Asia, the history of South Asia's international relations. At the time I was writing my PhD in 2008, 9, 10. That's when it was kind of taking off, and there was this real kind of interest in trying to understand diplomatic history in South Asia's international history in a more rigorous way than what had been done so far. And part of it was to try to come to a more rigorous analysis of South Asia's international relations itself. And it was, I mean, the big conversation at the time was that, look, too much of international relations in South Asia is just, it's too Eurocentric. And we keep kind of pretending like we're kind of France or Germany or the United Kingdom, and where we are bound by the same sorts of international norms and rules that these European countries first evolved, invented, and then followed. And India is going to be just, the theory of interstate relations in the South Asian regions was that it has to follow the same kind of logic. And there was this kind of not reaction against it, but reaction to it. At the time I was writing my PhD, and people were sort of saying that in order to really come to a more rigorous account of South Asia's interstate relations, we have to engage with its own distinctive history in a more rigorous way, and try to think about these states as historically informed actors. And it was through those sorts of, with that kind of in mind, that I was writing my book about how the partition shaped the way in which India and Pakistan dealt with each other, and the diplomatic relationship between India and Pakistan was forged. And I was, and I was trying to, and while I was, so the PhD dissertation itself was really about the administrative consequences of partition on South Asia, and how institutions in South Asia were shaped by the partition. But as I was writing my dissertation, I kind of started to realize that there was a really interesting story to be told about how the foreign ministries, the new foreign ministries, the early foreign ministries of India and Pakistan, how they were influenced by the processes of partition, and how these institutions were really a set of actors that were kind of reacting to the process of partition more than any other set of norms. So I was, the book itself is trying to, so really the book is trying to tell the story of how did the partition influence the shaping of India-Pakistan relations in the 1950s. And what its kind of key argument is that there's a, what the book is arguing is that there, contrary to a lot of the literature on India-Pakistan relations, which kind of characterized it as a relationship that was doomed to hostility and enmity and volatility from the get-go, and it was doomed to this kind of volatility because of the circumstances of the partition, because of the context of the partition, that thing in 1947, that irreversibly set in motion a set of things that made India and Pakistan kind of compulsively enter into like a knee-jerk state of opposition with one another. And that the circumstances of the partition were one of the, the circumstances and the legacy of the bitterness of the partition that kind of irresistibly propelled India-Pakistan relations into a kind of foretold story of enmity from the beginning. And one of the things I find in the, when I was doing my dissertation was that there was actually, contrary to this kind of narrative that you find in a lot of literature on India-Pakistan relations, and if you look at the titles of the books, for example, it's often like, it's a very personified kind of story of blood brothers, stuck in a deadly embrace, like, kind of in a kind of sibling rivalry that comes from being in a, that were kind of delivered by like this midwife. It's a very personified kind of family history kind of description. And so why is the relationship so bad? It's because they were given, they were delivered wrongly by this British midwife. And that birth kind of propelled them into this bad relationship. And so contrary to that kind of depiction of India-Pakistan relations, what really does come across in the 1950s is that there was in fact a really dense and thick and kind of constructive set of bilateral engagements on a very wide variety of topics, which were at the time just as explosive as the Kashmir situation. And what what came across when I was looking at files about diplomatic exchanges on the implications of partition, what I found was a very thick set of engagements with between bureaucrats and ministers and prime ministers and provincial chief ministers on a whole host of issues that related to the implementation of partition, of the decision of partition. And for one thing, this kind of very dense engagement, and the files that I looked at were really like they were, they were sort of. Files of like inter-dominion chief ministerial conferences on the question of migrants, or inter-dominion chief minister conferences on the question of water or evacuee property. And these files, for one thing, it was a startlingly frank set of exchanges where stakeholders from a variety of different levels of government, from assistant to deputy to secretaries to foreign ministers to prime ministers, it was a very wide representation of opinion, and it was from on both governments, and it was a set of exchanges which was startlingly kind of frank in that, all these actors knew exactly what was going on, as far as the other was concerned, and there was no room for kind of artifice. So that tone of interaction sort of belies the way in which a lot of India-Pakistan relations is described in terms of a more like a kind of strategic rivalry for and nuclear brinksmanship, and like the arms race in South Asia, and like the balance of power in South Asia, and that kind of imagery that we use to describe a lot of interstate relations, today was not borne out by the way in which bilateral exchanges were being carried out on these other issues relating to the partition. And and in fact, not only were these exchanges surprisingly frank, but they were also very constructive, and they were actually quite the object of these engagements was to implement and entrench the fact of the partition. And the way in which the bilateral relationship was sort of productive during this particular period was based on the joint recognition that the partition had to be given an administrative expression, and it had to be entrenched more, and it had to be recognized. And there were a set of actors in both governments who understood this, and it was on the basis of this kind of joint recognition that bilateral engagements were conducted. And so this sort of understanding about the partition and the spaces of collaboration that it opened up was not necessarily adequately addressed in much of the historiography on India-Pakistan relations as it existed then. I also want to, some of this is also to do with how we, is also to do with the process of state formation in South Asia, and how, and so the reason that there was a kind of constructive dialogue between India and Pakistan in the 1940s was not simply, was not simply like these guys were in a good mood and like they felt like being nice to each other only. It was also, it was the imperative of state formation, and it was this pursuit of the idea of the state, like this fundamental unit of international politics in the 20th century, this desire to get to that thing by India and Pakistan. It was that kind of necessity for state formation that undergirded a lot of collaborative acts between India and Pakistan during this time. And it was, and so what the book is arguing is that acts of engagement between India and Pakistan are really, a feature of the necessity for for the state to be finalized in South Asia. And it's out of that kind of recognition that in the pursuit of that kind of goal, that a lot of, which is really about finalizing and entrenching the partition once and for all, that a lot of collaborative acts between India and Pakistan take place. I'd like to talk you through this quote, which I really love to read out because it kind of, it's really helpful to me in terms of.
Why is it not?
Oh.
Let's see. You're showing us this.
Yeah, wait.
Let's.
Oh wait, is it to do with?
Yeah, I think it's not connected. Okay, that's what's happened. Yeah, I'll fix it.
Oh no, wait.
The keyboard.
Huh?
I think it's connected to the keyboard.
That was on the keyboard.
Oh, is it?
Oh, here is your.
Okay.
It's already loaded.
Okay.
So I think you may have to from here, manage from here. Yeah?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Professor Walker.
That's right. See?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's this really helpful quote that I like talking through because it helps me lay out the argument of the book more. It's a quote from a fortnightly report written by the Deputy High Commissioner of India in Karachi in 1948. And the quote is that there are no parallels anywhere to the nature of diplomatic relations subsisting between India and Pakistan or to the type of system evolved for conducting these relations. And the thing that struck me about this quote is that, what he seemed to be talking about was that, he was writing in 1948. He could have been writing about the war conceivably have been writing about the war in Kashmir. He could have been speculating about the state of preparedness of either army or their chances of victory. He could have been writing about how is it that India and Pakistan are going to be talking about the Kashmir issue at the UN. Or he could have been talking, he could have been adhering to the imagery that we use when talking about India-Pakistan relationship and the quest for strategic balance. And instead, he seems to be suggesting that while those issues are true, there's something even more intractable and deeper, and like an even more deeper problem in the way in which the India-Pakistan relationship has to be conceptualized. And the India-Pakistan relationship is not like any other kind of tense interstate exchange in the world, and it's not like any other international relationship. It's a relationship that's just not like any other in the whole world, and when he was writing this quote, like his office was stuck in the middle of a kind of interminable and like lengthy and like kind of just endless requests of paperwork relating to the minutiae of partition, which were kind of again, like the daily reality of his office was at a complete remove from the imagery that we use to describe India-Pakistan relations, and the daily reality of his office was, in a sense, even much more personal than the rules of a zero-sum strategic rivalry. And he was sort of, dealing with interminable paperwork relating to kind of, marriage licenses or death certificates or property deeds or educational certificates or, things that really couldn't be more personal and things that were really like the wheat and chaff of like everyday life. And he was, in a sense, what he was getting at was that in order for that kind of imagery of India-Pakistan relations to work, in order for there to be any kind of strategic rivalry or any kind of relationship at all, it was, his office was at the heart of enabling that relationship, that to work. And it was, in order for that to happen, actually you needed an office that could also administer the consequences of partition and give meaning to the logic of implementing the partition correctly. And in a sense, in order for that kind of India-Pakistan relationship to be, it was important for his office to kind of perform statehood and to kind of create the fact of Indian statehood in South Asia in order for a bilateral relationship to take place. And it's this, it's the pursuit of this kind of idea of, of trying to create statehood, or finalizing statehood by both India and Pakistan that lay at the heart of a collaborative set of exchanges on, on bilateral relations in the aftermath of the 1950s, in the aftermath of the partition. Are we okay on time? Or are we? Right. I want to very, just talk you through the set of issues that this book goes through, and what it's, what it's trying to highlight is the fact that, that alongside the Kashmir issue, what's also striking about this period is that there's, that there's also a very dense set of collaborative dialogues between India and Pakistan at a variety of intergovernmental levels on a variety of issues relating to evacuee property, to water, to trade, as to the process of deciding what to do on the question of Bengal refugees in Bengal and the way in which the Nehru-Liaquat Pact of 1950 was signed, something that's been back in the, the other thing I like to say about this book is that, at the time of writing in 2008 in Cambridge with Joya Chatterjee, I had no idea about how, what was meant to be like a humble kind of academic book about diplomatic history would kind of come head on with the, with the political issues of the 2020s, and I had no idea that so much of what the book was getting at would suddenly become like the stuff of like newspaper headlines. And so one of the things that it's talking about is the Nehru-Liaquat Pact, and this, again, like this desire to kind of implement the partition and to give it meaning. It's out of that collaborative impulse that the two prime ministers met on the, on the issues of refugees in Bengal and came to an agreement about it. And it's and
Pallavi, could you say a bit more about how the concept of minority rights or minority protection, how was it defined in Nehru-Liaquat Pact? Could you say a bit more about that?
Yes. So the Nehru-Liaquat Pact was actually quite a, was actually like a very unusual text, even by the standards of its time. It was signed in April 1950 between Nehru and Liaquat Ali Khan in Delhi. It was, it was kind of, it was, the text of the agreement said that the governments of India and Pakistan would be, that the high commissions of India and Pakistan would be legally empowered to be able to go to their opposite government and ask for solutions to be devised in cases of minority ill treatment. It was signed in the context of a growing political crisis around refugee movements in Bengal as their volume increased more and more, and amongst the clamor of provincial chief ministers who were complaining to their central governments about how their central governments were being too weak on Pakistan and not doing anything about the numbers that they were inundated with. The issue taking on a political toxicity which could challenge the stability of both Nehru and Liaquat Ali Khan's governments. And it's in that kind of context that there's a kind of recognition by Nehru and Liaquat Ali Khan that something needs to be done, and a common interest to kind of save the stability of their government.
So it was basically about minorities as they related to Bengal, not minorities per se.
It was minorities in Bengal.
Yeah.
It was, yes. And
So
the
East Pakistan and Bengal.
And the argument that the Pakistani delegates at the conferences made was that it should actually apply to all minorities.
Yes.
It should actually apply to Karachi, the Hindus coming into, it should apply, all across South Asia. And it was signed over the minority. It concerned the refugees in Bengal. But the other interesting thing about it was the sheer, for governments as notoriously prickly about their sovereignty as India and Pakistan are, and who are, in South Asian states that are as invested in, exclusivity and sovereignty, for two governments to sign a document that says that the representative of the other has legal powers to come to us and ask for redressal as far as minority rights are concerned. Even
so concern Bengal in this larger sense, so migrants from or refugees from East Pakistan into West Bengal and refugees from West Pakistan into East Pakistan, no?
So, yes.
Both were covered, right?
Both were covered. Both were covered, and the object was to reassure them and to sort of tell them that, look, there's this agreement in place, and so stay where you are, don't move. Because the governments of India and Pakistan are jointly invested in looking after your security. So that's why.
Just to further clarify, so it is specifically articulated as a
Bengali Hindus in East Pakistan and Bengali Muslims in West Bengal.
Because I looked at the Nehru Pact on the formation of the western border, and there it has this, at least in terms of political conversation, about the ways in which this might also be a way to address the question of North Indian Muslims and those who wanted to return. So this question of return is something I wonder where redress and return are both. My understanding was exceptional about this act, that it was, and you maybe coming to the question of return is not
The pact says that, okay, as far as Bengal is concerned, there's no reason to move because these governments are invested in your security. Secondly, it does bring about some amount of, it affects some amount of success as far as return is concerned. It had patchy degrees of success, but in the aftermath of this pact being signed, some 7,000 families across the Bengal, from West Bengal, do go back into East Pakistan. Some 4,000 or 5,000 do come to West Bengal. It's got patchy degrees of success, but it does at least provide a assurance on paper as far as minority rights are concerned. And what it kind of also sort of sets up is, what it's also sort of arguing is that, what it's also saying is that migrants are not told is that they can kind of carry on as if partition has not happened, and they should just pretend as if that there's no governments of India and Pakistan. And actually, this is a way of trying to give reality to the governments of India, the post-partition governments of India and Pakistan.
Would you allow one more clarification on this? The reason, two points here. One is that by 1950, correct me if I'm wrong, the migration across the western border had thinned down, whereas migration across the eastern border actually picked up pace.
It was threatening
right?
the governments.
Right?
Yeah.
So therefore, you had the Nehru-Liaquat Pact is about the eastern border, and the western border might have been raised as an issue, but it didn't really cover it, because where the migrants were at that point, right?
I mean, the reason it was signed is because it was posing like this huge political challenge in Bengal.
Bengal.
It's the
Yeah, and second, about Wazira's point about return, so I know the Raja Mahmudabad, not the old one, the son, and I don't know the grandson. I know, I've interviewed him a lot. The person called Raja Mahmudabad today, right? His son is a colleague of yours, I don't know him. But Raja Mahmudabad I know very well, and I've interviewed him extensively for my Hindu-Muslim book. He went with his father to Pakistan, but didn't want to stay there, came back. And there's a lot of dispute over the property.
still,
Right?
third gen. Yeah.
So were there many such cases on the eastern border, where people would go to Dhaka and then would want to come back to Murshidabad, or people who came to Calcutta would want to go back to
The
Dhaka?
eastern was completely different. I mean, in the
Yeah.
sense that the vast majority of the people in Bengal, we're not talking about expensive. We're not talking about rich people.
Right.
We're often talking about people who are too poor, and the reason they're a problem for the provincial governments to rehabilitate is they've got no resources of their own. So what are they to feed them with? These guys anyway don't have, any.
So
money.
property is not the main issue there.
So property, they don't. There's nothing to be gained from
I see.
making them live with you. So it's better that that some kind of mechanism is devised for them to stay where they are.
Right.
It's not like you get that much out of just welcoming them with receiving arms. Your interests are in kind of making this into a political issue and trying to kind of criticize the central government about
Sorry,
it.
I hope I didn't interrupt you, because it's such an important matter, Nehru-Liaquat Pact, right? So that's why the clarificatory question.
So there's
One more thing. So one is at the level of like what's in the agreement, right? That's worked out. Then is the correspondence between officials as they interpret the agreement and then say things possibly like, oh, let's pretend like there is no border or whatever, with actual negotiations, and then there is a lived experience of the people on the ground. So on the level of the actual agreement, there is.
Could you switch on your microphone? I got a message.
Oh.
Your own microphone, because it's being recorded, yeah.
Because it's being
Yeah.
recorded, I see. Just if you can say something about what's in the actual agreement in terms of its regionally specific, that agreement. The other thing is that it speaks of redress and forms of redress, but not specifically return. Although then, when it's actually negotiated amongst officials, all of these things, because part of redress requires return, etc. So that's why I'm trying to, what's in the agreement? What is the level of actual interpretation and negotiation that officials are doing? What's happening on the ground is happening on the ground. But obviously, because the officials are responding to what's happening on the ground. So just to get a sense of the level of autonomy that the bureaucrats of the young states have, because they're actually having to imagine and create the states, as you're arguing beautifully, how they assert that degree of autonomy in interpreting and making good on.
Yeah. So the text of the agreement is I mean, it's I could it's it's an appendix in the book. It's actually one of the more enlightened pieces of writing as far as the bilateral relationship is as far as the 50s is concerned. It's actually also quite strikingly reminiscent of minority agreements that are signed in interwar Europe. As far as how minority rights are conceptualized, the text says that that they're free to worship and go to the educational institutions that they want, and they the cultural rights that they have, they're free to do all of these things. If they don't, then they can also go to the High Commission of India and ask for something that say that these rights are being violated, and the High Commission of India has the legal ability to go to the government of Pakistan and raise this issue. So it's I mean, and what it's also kind of, I mean, what I say in the book is that, look, it's also a way of trying to answer this question about trying to think about South Asian sovereignties in a less Eurocentric way, and it's, you know, it's trying to think about like different ways of defining sovereignties, and it's trying to kind of, what it's saying is that these post-partition states, they can, on this particular issue, there's a way of thinking about, you know, a jointly constituted sovereignty as far as the refugee issue is concerned, as far as the minority issue is concerned. Now, what I say in the book is that there's, you know, there's a stormy aftermath to the pact. Two very senior cabinet ministers of Nehru, Neogi and S.P. Mukherjee, they resign in protest. They, you know, it's seen as like this kind of, you know, climb down to Pakistan and like, you know, this appeasing thing that Nehru did because of his liberal, you know, ideas. And it's you know, and surprisingly enough, it was actually Sardar Patel who sold the, you know, who went to kind of recalcitrant ministers in the Congress and asked and sold the idea of the pact to them. And he said that, well, this is the only option there is as far as Bengal is concerned. Like, you know, we've tried everything else, it doesn't work. We have to do this pact. So it was Sardar Patel who argued in favor of it. And what was done was to create like these branch secretariats in Bengal that were kind of like these offshoots of the foreign ministries in you know, and in the region, and that were responsible for handling the paperwork as far as you know, complaints were concerned about the situation of minorities. And what, you know, now some, you know, there's a quote in the book which says that, you know, some officials in the Ministry of External Affairs said that, look, the branch secretariat is just like this place where there's a lot of like useless paperwork about like, you know, like this lengthy and interminable correspondences about individual issues of like minority discrimination in Bengal. Like, it's not, you know, the heart of the ministry. But at the same time, what's also striking about it is that those secretariats, they're not scrapped, and they stay in place right until 57, 58, and they're allowed to kind of carry on with the work. And you know, the question of, I mean, the chief secretaries' conferences of Bengal and the High Commission, the meeting between, you know, High Commissioners in Bengal, you know, they routinely bring in conversations about minority rights. And at one stage, the, you know, the deputy, the High Commissioner in Dhaka is sort of, you know, there's this exchange between official in Delhi, SN, and the Deputy High Commissioner in Dhaka. And, you know, SN is saying that, you know, I don't like this idea about how minorities from another country have this ability to be, you know, to be able to go to our High Commission and ask for something to be done. And there's something wrong here as far as, you know, how thinking about international affairs is concerned or interstate relations is concerned. Like this text that provided for these minorities to be able to go to the High Commission, like, you know, he's telling the Deputy High Commissioner in Dhaka that be careful with how you treat these complaints.
But Pallavi, this is the last. This particular text that you're citing talks about minorities in general, not just Bengal.
It's called the Bengal Pact, like
and
it's signed in response to the minorities, you know, to the refugee crisis in Bengal in April 19. I mean, the reason that it's signed is because of that.
But he doesn't say that here. The text is about minorities in general.
But it's I mean, it's saying that, yeah. It's
For all practical purposes, Bengal is the issue, what you're saying, even though it's conceptually formed more generally.
Yeah. I mean, it's about the minorities in, I mean, so the places where institutions were set up as a response to the Bengal Pact with like these branch secretariats in Bengal. But I mean, and the idea was that it's just kind of reassuring minorities across South Asia that they don't need to flee, that they should stay where they are, and that they don't need to kind of come and inundate like provinces in the other country with demands for rehabilitation. Like that's the intent behind the pact. So yeah, so there's, and I also like want to, so the thing with the Bengal Pact is that while the refugee crisis is happening in Bengal over 1948, 49 and 50, and as this political crisis over the refugee question is reaching its head, at the same time there's also this lengthy correspondence between Nehru and Liaquat Ali Khan over the prospect of a potential no-war pact. And what they're also doing, so for one thing, they're writing to each other almost daily over the refugee issue. But for another thing, they're also, in February 1950, Nehru kind of gives voice to an idea that he's been toying with for some, he's in San Francisco and he's asked that what you're going to do over the Pakistan issue. And he says that, well, one thing we could explore is a no-war pact. And a pact that would kind of legally make it illegal for India and Pakistan to go to war with one another. And the thing about this kind of idea is that it's actually based on the Bryant-Kellogg Pact, signed in interwar Europe in the 1930s, and it was this kind of mechanism to that kind of said that if one European country declares war on the others, then all the other European countries are treaty bound to go to this first European country's defense. And it's that kind of way of thinking about interstate relations that's at play when they're kind of exploring the contours of a no-war pact. So Nehru writes to Liaquat Ali Khan saying, what do you think of this idea? Liaquat Ali Khan writes back that we should explore the contours of it. This is a year-long correspondence, which is often carried out in public. Nehru and Liaquat Ali Khan, they both stand in their constituent assemblies and weather questions from skeptical opponents about the course of this correspondence. They're also telling the world that we're trying. It's also about telling the world that that both states are kind of interested in a better relationship. I mean, the object of the correspondence is to tell the world about it, rather than actually get to a no-war pact itself. It becomes quite clear from after the first few weeks that the correspondence has taken place that the pact is not going to be signed, and the reason it's not going to be signed is because the government of Pakistan is saying that, okay, in the clauses of this potential no-war pact, we should have writing about clauses relating to Kashmir and water sharing and evacuee property. Like that should be in the text of the pact too. And what the government of Pakistan also says is that as far as a no-war pact is concerned, like it's already, according to the UN, it's already UN that we're both signatories of, it's already illegal for one country to declare war on the other country. So as far as just that provision is concerned, that's meaningless. If in order for us to commit to this kind of pact, writing also needs to be evolved on these other issues. And Nehru himself, toys with the idea of providing for language on the questions of Kashmir and evacuee property, but his bureaucrats in the Ministry of External Affairs advise him not to. And Girija Shankar Bajpai says that, Nehru instructs Girija Shankar Bajpai to at least write a draft with the clauses that the government of Pakistan is asking for, just to see what it looks like. And Girija Shankar Bajpai does this, but also advises Nehru, says that, this it may not be, it may be too expensive for India to kind of commit to all these provisions in writing. So, but what's interesting about, this, it becomes quite clear as the correspondence wears on, after the first few months, it becomes clear by August 1950 or so that the pact is not going to be signed, like this agreement is not going to be signed. But it's carried on nonetheless, and it's sort of, the fact that it's carried on is also made clear to the rest of the world. But the provisions that, the relevant provisions won't materialize as far as, practical purposes are concerned, but the Bengal Pact is signed in April 1950. So what's also going on in this, during this time is there's a variety of very complicated agendas, and it's a way of Nehru to kind of try to find space to fashion an alternative narrative as far as Pakistan is concerned. I mean, it's not like he'll sign the pact, but the fact that he's publicly saying that he's carrying on this correspondence also opens up spaces for a different way of thinking about India-Pakistan relations, rather than just this thing that has to be gone to war to over the refugees issue, So what it also sort of shows us is that these engagements between India and Pakistan, public political engagements between India and Pakistan, I mean, there's often like a lot of backstory in there, and complicated political agendas that are being carried out at the same time, that are not necessarily only about international politics, but also domestic politics. I think I should stop, and thank you all for your excellent questions.
Shall we start with you, Wazira?
Sure. It's nice to have a small community to really have a conversation, and I hope you didn't mind us.
No, I loved it. Thank you so much. It was excellent.
But it seems like it's a really important ethnography of the state. But I think we don't have enough historical ethnographies of the state that you actually look at how state formation takes place from its own democratic actors. And the process of both personal relations, but also different kinds of imaginaries are at work on what constitutes a sovereign nation state should look like. And I think very much in keeping that, your starting point was very much about international relations, as if you already have two constituted nation states. But the story you're telling is one of how though there's a process by which they have to imagine and constitute these two nation states. And so the historical ethnography actually gets you to look at and take seriously the actors and how to do that as work every day. And just in that framing, like thinking about how all of these questions, is it good, they're obviously drawing upon, it's one of the first decolonial settings as well in the world. And so what is that process going to look like? First, partition. I wonder if I wonder, I mean, I have a lot of questions in thinking with this, because I wonder to look at, for example, the Turk-Greek
Population exchanges, yeah.
Which is also at that moment after the war of making, although the Greek state has emerged a century earlier, it's never been sort of clear what it as an entity is, because it is so disparate, made up of so many different peoples, as is the case with Turkey. And so I wondered, now there is this more recent book, Humanitarian Crisis, which we read in our seminar, which looks at that exchange in really interesting sort of way, as a formation of nation-state projects, importantly. So I wondered, like, to what extent they're obviously reflecting back on like the global landscape from which they are emerging. We need to
Yeah. I'm going to answer the first question about the global context of the 1930s and 40s and population exchanges and the conversations about population exchanges that were being had in South Asia. And I also wanted to kind of, make a related point about, so one of the things that this book is also trying to argue for is a kind of intervention on the question of how we talk about the question of partition itself. And the thing with a lot of writing on the partition, not so much at the time that I was writing by the 2008s, but like the 70s and 80s, was that partition was often seen as like this, this calamity, this blunder, this kind of, this thing that happened because of the personal vaingloriousness of Nehru, or the greedy ambition of Jinnah, or the, the imperialist tendencies of the British, like this thing that could have otherwise have been avoided had it not been for like these mistakes that somebody or the other, according to your political inclination, made. And I think, one of the things that we have to try to do is take a step back from that kind of literature and to kind of think about partition in a slightly different way, and to sort of see it as a thing that that all kinds of different actors in South Asia were thinking about during the 1930s and 40s in a realistic kind of way, and they were kind of having conversations about minority politics, what kind of regimes are looking after minority politics better, what sorts of administrative devices have to be fashioned, and they saw what I say in the book is that partition was actually a reasonably well-established administrative strategy that had been followed in other parts of the world during the 20s and 30s, and wasn't like a South Asian thing, only, and it wasn't like a particularly, personal story of failure in South Asia. It was actually like a broader kind of process. And we also need to sort of think about the partition story in South Asia as part of that broader process. And if for no other reason, that it also kind of, what it does is that it colors our perspective on India-Pakistan relations, on Pakistan, on and on India, and I think one way of kind of getting away from that is to try to rejig the way in which we think about the process of partition and the way in which it was sort of being considered in South Asia. And I mean, so some of this is related to, because the refugee, the minority, the Greco-Turk population exchange was the subject of rife conversation in South Asia, and it was sort of quite closely followed by Indian politicians all through the 30s and 40s who sort of thought about what this meant as far as South Asian politics was concerned. As far as the intimacy, I mean, what I say in the book is that, look, so we're dealing with a set of actors who do know each other very well, and who are very familiar with each other's political context and are often kind of colleagues and, related and kind of, from the same elite strata. In government, so and those sorts of connections is playing a role in the way in which the India-Pakistan relationship is being forged in these first few decades, and the kind of better tone in the relationship. One aspect of the story is these personal connections, but the other aspect of the story is also like this pursuit of like complete statehood, and the way in which these guys were thinking about, we have to give partition meaning so that we can be like fully formed national actors on the global stage.
Yep, Rehan.
Thank you for listening, and thank you
and
for
Suved, after you.
and this is heroic what you're doing right here.
Suved, are you going first or Rehan going first? Rehan's going first.
First of all, thank you so much. It's really such a rich project, and especially, someone who's also felt IR theory, at least the way it's taught in the global north, has a certain paucity to it. This project, the way it transcends like a deep attention to history and also helping us think about what does IR look like from South Asia. I think that's it's a really rich project. I had just two questions. One is just building off the conversation we just had to Wazira's point, that partitions are happening in Greece and Turkey, all over Europe, population transfers for these new states, post-war states. So one is just like how different then in that global context is the Nehru Pact? Because states, even hostile states, if we think of Greece and Turkey, are cooperating, right, on these very real, almost administrative issues of population transfers and then the role of rights. The second question, and I think it was in your presentation that I've been sort of at least thinking about Pakistan a lot, is how important this kind of cooperation is to the very essence of state building. You know, so in Pakistan in the early years, this period, you see this, Wazira's book, other scholars, the poaching of, what Hamza Alvi calls the Salaliyat, the poaching of bureaucrats, the poaching of engineers, the poaching of, this is being, I don't know, but this is being facilitated by the governments on the other side, right? And this becomes, these people, these transfers from the visa become essential to building that state, building the institutions of that state. So in some ways it's facilitated. A last thing that I'd say, even something this has just occurred to me, with so much has changed, and I'd be curious to hear what the markers is 71 the markers of the end of this cooperation. But even the last time which president was it that went to Delhi, I forget the leader, but they said there's always been a tradition, and I've always been struck by that the Pakistani government leaders, when they come to Delhi, at the Pakistan embassy, they invite leaders of the Hurriyat. And they're like, we have a tradition where we can invite, and the Indian government then. And to me that's so striking that here these two hostile nations, there's a claim to a historical precedent that in the capital of the other nation there, and that is, that has been honored. It's quite striking, right, for countries. So I guess for you, what are the markers of the end of this kind of cooperation?
Yeah, let me answer your last question first. And, so the reason I call it an alternative history of the India-Pakistan relationship is because, there's a way of talking about a relationship that's different from merely war or peace. And there's like a whole lot of stuff in the middle too that is often missed out in the way that we talk about India-Pakistan relations, right? And we just think that it's like war, and, kind of escalating crisis. And what that kind of misses out is this other texture in the relationship, which is not about kind of peace, but it's not war, and it's it's a kind of everyday exchange about interstate affairs that are that are not necessarily about just tension. So I mean, I think we have to kind of come up with like a different language to kind of think about India-Pakistan relations, and see how even in this, in what is undoubtedly like a very bloody story, there are actually islands of agreement that are upheld between both states, simply in terms of the recognition that that the other had to exist. And a lot of different kinds of actors had stakes in ensuring that this recognition was in place. And so it's I mean, the bilateral relationship, it's also held in place by a set of elites who want a state to be in place. And even though that carries with it often, brutal and majoritarian exclusive tendencies, but the pursuit for that kind of that kind of definition of statehood, also had a set of kind of bias, if you like, in the post-47 movement. And it's, I mean, in the book, like I call it capitalizing from the partition, and a lot of bureaucrats in particular, were quite happy, wanted for those definitions to be in place, and so wanted for a cleaner definition of partition to be set up. And were envisioning India-Pakistan relations as a product of that. And that thing is not necessarily a story of just enmity, or even peace, but like it's a grayer kind of area, and more language needs to come up to think about what those issues mean. So that's, I mean, like these, like it's like. And I mean, like we've been reading about, like, this missile that was accidentally fired, and I think, I mean, it had a different kind of vocabulary of India and Pakistan relations been in place, then we wouldn't have seen it as an almost war situation, but like a really bad mistake. But we would have been able to kind of describe that incident in a more nuanced way than like a short of war kind of situation. So that's the other. Your first question was about.
Just like about how is this unique in that this global context of partitions and
How unique is it?
is it actually a part of like this kind of cooperation between hostile states?
So it's, I mean, what the book is saying is that, look, it's not, I mean, it's certainly, it's not unique, and I mean, I don't know if I can go as far as to say that, look, it's just the same as Palestine and Israel, or it's just the same as Northern and, the Union of Ireland versus the Republic of Ireland. I mean, but there are certainly parallels, and I think we have, so one way of kind of gaining a sense of perspective on the India-Pakistan issue is to examine other contexts of colonial partitions, and to look at issues that those situations confront, in order to kind of like get a sense of context as far as the India-Pakistan war and peace, war versus peace kind of storyline is concerned.
Suved, switch on there, yeah.
Yeah, hi. Hi, thank you so much for the talk, and I know it's lovely outside, but it was equally lovely to sit here and listen to you. Just wondering if you could, you talked about the reception of the pact and these steps on the India side of things in terms of like conversations between ministers and bureaucrats. If you could provide a sense of what was happening on the other side, on the Pakistan end of things. And one, you mentioned that this kind of conversation became topical in recent years, like the headline stuff. I think I have a sense, but if you could kind of elaborate on that. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so as far as the, if I could, there's a bit I want to, as far as the pact itself is concerned in Pakistan, like, so it's not signed in 1950. And it's, a reception of that is sort of, depending on where you are in the political spectrum, like it's met with kind of the Times of India sort of says, oh God, we told you so, like this is just Nehru off doing his thing, like any realist understanding of interstate foreign relations would have made it perfectly clear that no government can afford to commit itself in writing to issues on Kashmir. Just as well that pact failed, like he was just kind of, performing for the Constituent Assembly. And then the Dawn had said that, well, see, this is just more proof of like Bharat's intransigence, and like if it wants to convince the international community of its, earnestness in seeking peace, then it has to do better than to just like set up a conversation about a pact and then back out of the pact, just because they realized that it wasn't going to work. And again, like it was perfectly evident all through, like this was just like for the cameras, like it wasn't actually like a serious set of exchanges at all. But at the same time, like the thing about the pact is that, so even though in 1950 it wasn't signed, the idea of a no-war pact is periodically revived. And it's, it comes back in the 1960s and in the 1980s. It sort of sees, it's sort of, it's like, keeps on, whenever there's a need to kind of change the conversation, or to fashion it like a different, whenever a politician feels a need to want to have a new set of, a new direction as far as bilateral relations is concerned. It's a way of, it's a way of, changing the political moment and kind of diverting attention away from like, the usual state of bilateral relations into like the possibility of something more. And what's again also interesting about it is that, so when this pact was being signed, now there's a lot of, skepticism in the papers about, is this even going to work? Like what kind of people are trying to, in South Asia, like they're just trying to copy like the Brian Kellogg Pact in Europe, how will it work in South Asia? Like it's just not realistic. But at the same time, Nehru realizes it's a realistic political device as far as trying to change the topic is concerned. So it's not as if it's simply like a whimsical kind of, like fleeting desire for peacemaking that really has no realistic kind of option. It was effective in, in steering one set of conversations about Pakistan, so it's not necessarily something that needs to be seen as only like a doomed thing, particularly because it is periodically revived in the subsequent stages of the relationship.
Yeah. Could you also introduce yourself?
Thank you for the presentation and congratulations on your book. So I had the chance to go through your book, but I had a more general question about something you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, which was about how your approach is trying to step away from Eurocentric approaches. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how you were trying to accomplish that. And the second question was sort of like, how would you categorize this book? Is it, is it like, high history, diplomatic history, or because Professor Vashni mentioned that there is this element of quotidianness in your work. So I'm wondering if you shift your gaze, or if you're, talking mainly about the quotidian element in the sort of everyday exchanges of diplomatic exchanges. So.
Yeah. So although the correspondence failed to result in a declaration in 1950, this was not the only time that such a possibility would be examined. The political potential of such a declaration tempted the leadership of both countries at various junctures in the India-Pakistan relationship. Nehru would renew his offer again in 1956 and 1962. In 1959, Pakistan made a joint defense proposal to India, and some 20 years later, a no-war pact was offered by President Zia. None of these proposals were rejected in instinctive and hasty reaction to the idea of compromising with Pakistan or vice versa, but were used as political devices, but were kind of realistically examined. And the other kind of thing that I just very quickly want to, the conversation about the pact, like what emerges from these discussions are in fact not the contours of a policy of the paramountcy of self-preservation against the other, which was immediately grasped and pursued by implacable statesmen for the benefit of their own countries, but rather a more uncertain, tenuous and fragmented set of policies, often flexible and sometimes discarded. By the close of 1950, Nehru himself had also reached a similar conclusion. During the year, one major agreement with Pakistan on minorities had been reached, but another, the No-War Pact, had failed. To Parliament, in response to a question aimed at criticizing his approach to India's foreign policy, he argued, quote, "We have to deal with matters as they come up. In matters of foreign policy especially, one has to decide almost every hour what has to be done." Idealism could also play a role in the shaping of foreign policy, since it was merely, he insisted, perhaps even somewhat problematically, the capacity to know what is good for the day after, or tomorrow, or the day after, or for the next year, and to fashion yourself accordingly. So what the book is trying to say is that there's no fixed, inevitable kind of story in India-Pakistan relations. Like it's a much more contingent set of choices. based, I think, on the process of state formation, on the pursuit of state formation. So, what you're saying about, like, is it history or, like, not that I've talked about it in this book, but I think that, South Asia's history, the study of like history, does need to have a much more important kind of space in the way in which we think about South Asia's international relations, and we need to kind of, think about South Asian states as a product of like specific circumstance and kind of modern history, and we need to kind of look at those processes in as much detail as possible when trying to explain like how South Asia's IR works.
Great. Thank you.
Any? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm a postdoc at the Watson Institute. So my question is about whether, if you can speak more to this relationship between trying to finalize the state or get to state completion and the process of trying to finalize or really actually define and definitively define an Indian or Pakistani citizen. So how are those two processes in what you look at odds with one another, or are they aligned processes? Or how do you sort of read that? And then the second question is about how, so you talk about these islands of agreement, and I was wondering if you could speak more to what gets, both parties on that island, and whether you see that as like a good faith. Mm-hmm. I know this is like a leading question in some ways, but of course it's not a fully good faith thing, but where are those moments of good faith as opposed to, I don't know, some sort of mutual interest? And one way to look at that question would be how do you read these moments of sort of diplomatic interaction and agreement as opposed to parallel forms of local laws and things that are passing? So what I'm thinking of is, this is in 1950, the Nehru Liaquat Act, but then you have Pakistan doing the Objectives Resolution in 1949 or something. So how do you sort of read those two things at parallel or intersecting with one another?
So like in the beginning I was talking about, again, like back in 2008, like I had no idea that the Citizens Amendment Act would kind of come out just when this book was being published, and how, things that I thought were the stuff of like dusty archival history related everyday quotidian kind of, things relating to the partition would suddenly become so much of the mainstream conversation about politics in South Asia. Citizenship in South Asia, is a deeply mutually constituted process. And a part of what is going on with the citizenship, story is also the property story. How do I get to be a citizen? Well, if I own property, then I'm going to have a better right to be a citizen. And if I own property from the majority community, then I have a even better right to be a citizen. And my way of owning property in South Asia in the aftermath of partition is actually part and parcel of the inter-dominion conferences between India and Pakistan, and how they're trying to make statehood happen. And what's going on with the evacuee property conferences is that there's again like this, it's a deeply complicated story, all kinds of lobbies of refugees who want property on the one hand in Delhi, who are saying that, look, all these people have left, why can't you just give us that land? And meanwhile, we're the guys who are sitting here and voting for you, So you have to take our inputs as far as making laws about this stuff is concerned more seriously than the guys who are not here, At the same time, it's not like people just left permanently. People hardly ever do that. And one of the state's most important roles is to look after, property rights. Like, why is the state even there? Like, it's the thing that makes sure that my right to property is sacrosanct. That's what it means. So it's not like, and India and Pakistan, bureaucrats are actually not comfortable with the idea of interfering with somebody's right to private property. Like the way in which ICS officials see it is like property is property. You know, like it's not something that you like saying that, oh well, if you're Muslim then you don't own the property anymore. Like that kind of position is not easily arrived at in Delhi, even though on the ground it may be happening, but it's not something that people feel very comfortable writing into laws so immediately. And it's also not the way in which and what's also happening is that now I might want to just take over the property that's been left behind and give it to the Hindu refugees who've come. But I can't just do that wholesale because all that will happen is that more refugees will land up, and the same thing can be replicated across the border. Like evacuee property legislations are being passed it's like mirror images of each other, and they're being passed almost like in collaboration, in consultation with one another. So I won't just make a wholesale law for all property in South Asia. What I'll do is I'll have a series of inter-dominion conferences and calibrate the processes in which this is being done, and sort of tell my counterparts that look, we'll pass a law for this part of UP, if you pass a law for that part of, and try to calibrate the process so that there's no uncontrollable movement of migrants coming in search of citizenship. So the way in which the evacuee property legislations are crafted are again what was recognized about this whole process is that even though there's a demand, a real demand, a political demand for land to be given to refugees, being made very vocally in both India and Pakistan. What both the governments recognized was that at the very least this had to be calibrated and controlled and done in consultation between the governments of India and Pakistan. So this is what the inter-dominion kind of conferences on evacuee property were about. And in a sense, through this whole process, like they were sitting and working out, the meaning of citizenship in both countries too.
May I refer you back to your one of your central points, which is that partition had to be given an administrative basis, and all of these deliberations, transactions, decisions by bureaucrats with respect to property, marriages, death certificate, birth certificate, were about also emerging, also about finalizing the state, your term, right? Finalizing the state. This is a part of state formation. This is what states do. They don't just fight wars. They give birth certificates, they give death certificates, they allocate property. They let people get married. Now, Aisha Jalal made this point in her first book long ago that since British India was concentrated first in Calcutta and then in Delhi, basically in Karachi, Pakistan's state began on a clean slate. There was nothing there. There was no office there. There's no papers. There's no filing cabinets, and etc.
Foreign ministry was almost non-existent
right.
in 1947.
Whereas Delhi had a great advantage because British India was headquartered there after 1911. Now, in your research about first of all, Karachi did not have even provincial governments set up. So that's the first question. I was very struck by that observation in the book. That Karachi had nothing, and Karachi was a big city like Bombay. Bombay and Karachi are both British cities after all. They were the pre-British Karachi, pre-British Bombay are fishing villages basically, right? So nothing, there was no infrastructure of any kind there. Is this a relative comment, or there's no office there? I mean, this is a very striking sentence there in the, And therefore, perhaps it would have been better to be headquartered in Lahore. Except it's not clear how the migrants, Urdu-speaking migrants, would easily make a home in a Punjabi-speaking Lahore. So just a commentary on that. What kind of office existed in Karachi? What kind of state existed in Karachi? And I think it's fair to say that because the central British state was headquartered in Delhi for 36 years before that, there was the greater infrastructure for a modern state there. But Karachi had nothing. That's the question I'm asking. Who was issuing birth certificates in Karachi before that? Death certificates, marriage certificates. Who was issuing all that? Who was registering property in Karachi before 1947?
In the book, what is, as far as the foreign ministries, the setting up the foreign ministries is concerned, I mean, by all accounts, the foreign ministry of Pakistan was a very badly staffed. I mean, Hussain Haqqani has written about it. Others have written about. I mean, many Pakistani bureaucrats themselves have written about in them. If there's one thing that South Asian bureaucrats do, it's write memoirs. You know, like this is and so I use a lot of my I piece together. I use a lot of memoir literature in my piecing together of the Pakistani side of the story, because even though I used a lot of files, like actual foreign ministry files from the government of India, and I was able to kind of get a much more granular sense of what is going on in the India side of the India-Pakistan story. Even though I used a lot of newspapers and kind of memoirs and papers from the National Archives in Dhaka as well as the British Library. It's not like I was looking at kind of government files, foreign ministry files in the, about the government of Pakistan in the way that I was with India. But by all accounts, the foreign ministry of Pakistan was a very thinly staffed and barely managed, set up on the hoof of, was set up, was sort of using the infrastructure of a provincial ministry as the basis of the new offices of the central governments of Pakistan. And they were using what little there was of the Sindh government's apparatus as part and parcel of the as their national capital.
That's the foreign ministry.
That's the yeah.
Right, and the other, but Sindh's provincial headquarters were in Karachi, or no?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that apparatus existed for birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, right? Didn't?
So, the other thing is, we're talking about South Asia, no? So, anyway, these are not European capital. Nobody is particularly rich.
Nobody is interested, certainly, in birth certificates. Nearly 2/3 of India didn't have birth certificate when my mother and father were growing up, right? So, but property was always registered.
So,
property was always registered, right? Whether or not you had a birth certificate, if you own property, you want to register your property.
It's, there's, I think with the, you can, if you need to register property, you have an office to register it in. She's also talking about how, the difference between the other thing I want to just very quickly add is that the Ministry of External Affairs in Delhi said that, look, as far as our functioning is concerned, there's not going to be that much change. We've already inherited all our infrastructure of foreign relations from the government of India, and all we need to do is just add one more desk for Pakistan. As far as our machinery is concerned, all the rest of the stuff as far as overseas Indians and Southeast Asia and Africa, that stuff we already have. There's a long tradition of running foreign affairs out of Delhi, which can be reused by the Ministry of External Affairs in Delhi in a way that that was not.
Pakistan would not have a South Bloc.
That's so
because the South Bloc existed only in Delhi. That's where the Ministry of External Affairs was.
Yeah. So they reused a lot of that apparatus, and they also used the legal language of that apparatus they kept. Whereas in, the government of Pakistan and the foreign ministry, they didn't have.
So this is basically, Aisha's claim is basically about the foreign ministry.
No.
Tell me. Because other bureaucratic offices were there in the provincial government of Karachi, which is a very important city of British India.
So she's talking about, so she's also talking about that whole argument is also about the nature of democracy and authoritarianism in South Asia.
No, the first book. That's the second one.
The
First
state
book is
of
the sole
martial rule.
spokesman.
The sole spokesman. And how there's, Stephen Wilkinson has been coming into this debate recently about, so one way of thinking about it is that, look, there's a thick machinery for administration plus politicians plus, a bureaucracy to exist in Delhi. Like that system is already in place because the administration is in place. And so that, creates like a way in which civil society has a stronger presence in India, in a way that you don't have administration in place.
So Karachi is like Bombay then? Karachi is not like Delhi, that's the claim then. Karachi is not like Delhi and cannot be because of this background, but Karachi is like Bombay. Provincial headquarter of Bombay, presidency is Bombay, right? And it also emerges roughly at the same time as Karachi does in British India. And provincial headquarters of Sindh is Karachi.
As a historian of Karachi,
Tell me.
I interject and say
Absolutely, yeah, correct.
maybe not necessarily so pivotal in understanding simply if the point is to argue that there's a fragility of statehood that makes the comparison between India and Pakistan incommensurate. If that's the intent, and why it's so significant to understand how fragile the conditions of statehood are in Karachi, aka capital of the new state, and the comparison is incommensurate. If that's the argument, right? If that's the argument that the two states are incommensurate, one with infrastructure, one without it, then perhaps giving a detailed accounting of that state, the infrastructure of the state. Yeah, actually now that I say it out loud, it might be actually very, very important. But the Karachi status as a satellite of Bombay, it is not a capital of the Sindh province until 1937. It's only been a decade since it became even a provincial capital. And then it is a much, much smaller in size and scale and significance as a city because it has, until there's no university, for instance. If you want to go to university, you would have to go to Bombay. If you had to give exams, if you had to play cricket matches, you went pretty much everything to Bombay, which was the capital of that entire region. But that specificity of like where Karachi is in relation to the larger colonial India that then will become post-colonial Pakistan, I think there's a great many accounts of it. I do a little bit of that work in my book, but there's a number of texts. There's a lot of historical work now of Sindh and of Karachi that thinks with that question. But
where was the capital of British Sindh, Wazira? Can you tell us where was it?
Karachi.
British Sindh from 1937 onwards.
Before 1937?
It was part of the Bombay presidency.
It is not a province.
So they're not, Bombay and Karachi are really not in that sense comparable.
They're not comparable for that sense.
A provincial government starts,
only a decade before. Yeah. And in fact, that's supposed to be considered pivotal. Anyway, not to go into the whole historiography on Sindh becoming a province, given that there's a vast sort of scholarship on that question itself. But yeah, like thinking about like the incommensurability of the two states in terms of their striving to statehood, one which already has infrastructure and the other which doesn't. I hope somebody does work on that. That'd be an interesting project to actually think about like what the absence of infrastructure means for that kind of striving, ultimately, of statehood in that context. I don't know if you see that. That's also when you say in at various moments that the officials wanted that state to exist, and therefore were willing to collaborate and concede and be consultative. Could be also, again, it's like you're looking at the Indian state officials in a granular fashion, thinking with another state that seems also, because of all of this, seems much more fragile. So you support that fragility in some
Another counterfactual question for both of you. So what is the basis then for, you must have investigated because you're historians of that period. So for a political scientist, it's a puzzle then. Why is Karachi chosen as the capital? Why not Lahore, which is much more institutionalized, which had all these offices for such a long time, which is actually the most important city of Punjab? So Indian Punjab is described by the agrarian history that I read when I was working in agriculture. Indian Punjab is described as much poorer than Pakistani Punjab in the 1950s. That's where the agricultural heart was. That's where the irrigation heart was, right? And Lahore was miles ahead of Amritsar and Ludhiana and all these places. And this is perhaps one reason why a new capital had to be created in Chandigarh, because every other town in Indian Punjab looked back or beyond, right? So what is the basis for then going to Karachi? This is a political science question now. And historians must have gone through what was the basis if it became a state capital, a provincial capital only in 1937. Yeah?
I mean, so as I said, this particular book is a sober history of the Ministry of External Affairs of the Foreign Ministry from 1950.
Maybe. There's many books to be written.
So it's,
Is Mr. Jinnah more comfortable in Karachi? Is there a personal question? Is he more comfortable in Karachi than in Lahore?
It's really a historian's challenge, isn't it? Because there's always like so much intimacy in the ways in which the actual nitty-gritty of relations, both relations on the ground but relations then of the state are forecast. And so you have this sort of intimacy on the one hand, and then on the other hand, it translates into abstract national regulative procedure. Mm-hmm. So there's two people sitting and they're like looking at it and they're like, "Arey, yaar, tumhare beti ki shaadi bhi to mujhe bulaya nahi." Or here's like, and then on the other hand, like there's like policy that's made that actually then gets abstracted and implemented and has all this scale to it. And I think a historian's challenge is really grappling with this difference in scale, and then how do you assign, what meaning do you assign to all of this layers, right? So like, is Jinnah more comfortable? I mean, that's like, there's so many imaginative projects around trying to make sense of intimacy and politics. The novelists do it really well, and I think Pallavi has undertaken this task, like, you know, with a kind of carefulness and thoughtfulness of how do you grapple with scale and give an account that's still going to be meaningful as a historian, intervening in a kind of literature that's already out there. So not being a novelist that can sort of move between those scales with a lot more, one could say, possibility of play and imagination, because we're not there at all the scenes, but only what's in the minutes.
You say that you can't move the capital to Istanbul, so you could be forced to Haripur.
Could you say that again? Yeah.
You can't, they say, move the capital to Istanbul from Karachi, so you could be close to Haripur.
Which is his home.
Yeah.
it's an open question, but it's an important question perhaps, but different, I think. from
And
the
I
question
guess
you
the
asked.
administrative center, that's not in Punjab, no? That must have been the thinking behind Karachi, like.
Also Jinnah's inclusion of Punjab in Muslim League politics is very late. That's also right.
I think
In 1937 they didn't go with the Muslim League, right?
Well, Karachi's
That is
choice
another
was
point. That is another point that Aisha is making, right? The regional parties are so strong, and so incorporating them under the Muslim League umbrella was
It's actually quite
a huge
difficult,
task,
yeah.
enormous task. Yeah.
Just one quick question. One of the things that I'm writing a historical chapter on the earlier, I was telling Wazira, the first 10 years of Pakistan, I've been thinking about this concept of bureaucratic authoritarianism. That how this, which I think, speaking to your project, the interlocutors on the Pakistani side are a set of non-elected bureaucrats, many of them, including the early prime ministers, coming from the Indian civil service who have now come to the other side. So regardless of these weak origins that Professor Jalal points to, very soon you have what Hamza Ali again calls the overdeveloped state. It's highly
This colonial army that explodes.
from slim beginnings on the edifices of provincial government institutions, then becomes this highly bureaucratized state that's capable
Aisha
of dealing with
Siddiqa,
a much
for
smaller
example.
institutionalized. So they've got
Actually,
diplomats.
that's a very good point.
So within 10 years, you've seen that allows them to be this much weaker, insecure state, to have a cadre of bureaucrats and diplomats. I'm wondering if that's, when thinking, because part of the IR argument is, which I think Wazira was talking to, is that it's based on the idea that these are two regular states that are interacting with each other.
Yeah, again, so the book, the reason it kind of, it charts it determinedly, the book doesn't get into these questions, partly because it stops at 1952. It's really like a attempt to kind of telling an institutional story of the foreign ministries, about, the kind of the impact of partition on the shaping of the India-Pakistan relationship. So the book doesn't get into it, but it's like, there's all kinds of different things going on as far as, how do we think about like the dynamics of provinces in South Asia, and which one emerges stronger, and which one emerges stronger and not, and in which ones are the armies strong, and those kind of provinces kind of overtaking the others. Like the institutional apparatus of the army in Punjab is much stronger, so that becomes the strongest provinces. One of the things that is going on. Look, it's also. I also think that we have to. There's more than just two imaginaries of the political future of South Asia at work here. It's not just one set of people saying like, oh, India is going to be, when I say state formation, India is also being formed. It's equally contingent about what kind of thing India is going to get created. It's also, sitting and dealing with princes, the sovereignties of princely states. How does a central government...
660 of them.
So there's, one way of thinking about this whole question is like a competition between different people's ideas of sovereignty, and it's not just two ideas, like it's all kinds of different people,
I have a PhD student at Harvard these days who's working on state capacity, building state capacity in India and Pakistan. We'll know a great deal more very soon, in about a year or so, 2 years. Exactly this question, state formation in India and Pakistan. And she's open to what exactly would emerge. Of course, data will determine what's emerging and how state capacity is conceptualized and measured. There's a lot of measurement going on in her dissertation.
It's a set of questions that's been developing more. I think it's this kind of research has taken off after the 2000s. No?
I think you're right, because the whole question of comparative state formation has become very important, at least in my discipline, very, very important. where you going and where you are, but it depends a lot on where you're from. So really, it's a very important thing to note that Karachi became a state capital, provincial capital only in 1937, right? It raises some other questions about why that was chosen as a capital of independent Pakistan, right? But that's a separate matter. So this whole question about building modern states, and a lot of it is going back to Charles Tilly, actually, right? When his account of how modern states emerge in Europe, right? Except that we don't want to go there. He says wars are making states. We don't want to have wars in now to make states, right? But historically, Tilly's argument is that wars are making states. And that's remained, and a lot of building states arguments today is a conversation with Charles Tilly, this big figure in this field. When he was writing that, people didn't take it very seriously. Only IR, in my international relations, which is also partly your discipline, which was taking it seriously. But now comparative politics, my main subfield is taking this whole idea extremely seriously, that the way your states emerge in Europe may have a lot to do, may have some general properties. Not all of them will be generalizable, may have some general properties. And weaknesses of states in much of the developing world may be because some of those processes were not there or could not be created, and in some cases happily could not be created. Because wars making states is a terrible, terrible empirical realization.
Marriage licenses in the High Commissioner's offices make states. So I guess it's...
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for presenting this work on a very important part of South Asian history, an important phase, and on a very important matter, how states started emerging and dealt with things that states do. I look forward to the next project is about 3 partitions, one in Palestine, one in Ireland, and one in British India. Whether some of the conceptualizations and imaginations were similar, and in what ways, if they were different.
Discuss it with her over dinner.
Yeah.
Because we will take her
Okay.
out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.